The moment the car door closed, the air inside the sleek black limousine shifted. Cold. Tense. Uncomfortable. The wealthy woman didn't even glance at the man behind the wheel. To her, he was nothing more than part of the machinery, an invisible function of her luxurious life. She barely looked up from her phone as she muttered, "Drive." The chauffeur, a tall, composed black man in a perfectly pressed uniform, said nothing. He adjusted his gloves, started the engine, and smoothly pulled away from the curb. The woman sighed, tapping at her screen. The city lights flickered across her face as the car rolled through the streets. But something felt off. She frowned. Normally, she could predict every turn, every red light, every familiar landmark. But tonight, the roads felt different. The city outside seemed darker than usual. The streets were eerily empty, as if the world had folded in on itself. She sat up slightly. "Where are we going?" The chauffeur didn't respond. Her tone sharpened. "Excuse me? Are you deaf? I asked you a question." Still, no answer. Her irritation bubbled. Who does he think he is? She knocked on the partition. "Hello? Are you mute, or just stupid?" The chauffeur's hands remained steady on the wheel. He didn't flinch, didn't react. The woman let out a sharp laugh. "Unbelievable. I pay you to drive me, not to ignore me. You should be grateful I even let you sit in the front seat of my car." Still, nothing. Something about his silence unsettled her. She huffed and looked outside again. Now she was certain, this wasn't the right way. The streets were completely unfamiliar. No cars. No people. No streetlights. Just endless, twisting roads stretching into an abyss of shadows. A chill crawled up her spine. She checked her phone. No signal. Her heart pounded as she gritted her teeth. "All right, enough of this. Where are we? You better turn around right now before I call the police." The chauffeur finally spoke. "Miss. There are no police here." His voice was deep, calm, too calm. She felt something shift. It wasn't just the city outside that felt foreign now. It was reality itself. The road ahead stretched endlessly into the darkness, like a place outside of time. And for the first time in her privileged, entitled life, she felt small. Helpless. And utterly, terrifyingly lost. The wealthy woman's heart pounded in her chest as she gripped the leather seat. "No police," she repeated, her voice sharp with disbelief. "What do you mean no police?" The chauffeur didn't answer. His hands remained steady on the wheel, his expression unreadable in the dim glow of the dashboard. She turned her attention back to the world outside. Where were the skyscrapers? The flashing billboards? The traffic? Everything looked wrong. The streets were vast and empty, stretching into darkness. The street signs were blank, as if the city had erased its own name. The buildings had no windows, just smooth, towering structures that loomed over the road like silent sentinels. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing. "This isn't real. This can't be real." "Stop the car," she ordered. The chauffeur didn't slow down. "Stop the car," she screamed, reaching forward to grab the wheel. The moment her fingers brushed against it, the world outside shifted. The buildings warped like melting wax. The road ahead curled into impossible angles. For a split second, she saw herself reflected in the windshield, but it wasn't her. The woman in the glass looked terrified. Broken. Desperate. She yanked her hand back with a gasp. Her voice trembled. "Where are we?" The chauffeur finally spoke. "Somewhere you belong." A cold dread settled in her chest. She scrambled for her phone. No signal. No GPS. Just an empty screen. Panic clawed at her throat. This isn't happening. I'm in control. I always have control. She turned her glare to the chauffeur, desperate to reclaim her power. Turn this car around right now, she commanded. I will have you fired, sued, and thrown in jail before you can even explain whatever sick game you're playing. Do you hear me? I own you. The chauffeur didn't even blink. Instead, he sighed. You don't own anything here. She froze. For the first time in her life, her threats meant nothing. She reached for the door handle, desperate to escape. Locked. She slammed her fist against the window. It didn't even shake. The road outside was changing again. The empty streets gave way to something familiar. Her childhood home. She gasped. It looked exactly as she remembered it, down to the old oak tree in the yard. But something was different. There were people standing outside. Dozens of them. All staring at the car. She peered through the tinted glass, her breath hitching. She recognized them. A waitress she once mocked for being too slow. A janitor she had demanded be fired for not cleaning fast enough. An assistant she humiliated in front of an entire boardroom. Their faces were blank. Their eyes locked onto hers. The chauffeur slowed the car to a stop. What is this? She whispered, her voice shaking. The chauffeur turned to her, his deep brown eyes filled with something unreadable. You're about to find out. The locks clicked open. The door swung wide on its own. The door swung open with a slow, ominous creak. The wealthy woman froze, her breath caught in her throat as the silent figures outside took another step toward the car. She knew them. Every single face. A waitress she once mocked in a 5-star restaurant. A janitor she berated for not cleaning quickly enough. An assistant she humiliated in front of an entire boardroom. A driver she insulted for simply existing. Their eyes were unreadable, no anger, no emotion. Just judgment. She shrank back into the seat, her throat tightening. What is this? She whispered, barely able to get the words out. The chauffeur sat perfectly still, hands resting on the wheel. His voice was calm. Too calm. A world of your own making. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. No. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be. She tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a nightmare. A vivid dream. Maybe she had fallen asleep in the car. Yes. That had to be it. But then the people outside took another step forward. And she felt it. The air. The heat of their stares. The slow shift of the wind. This wasn't a dream. The waitress, the one she had mocked for being too slow, tilted her head slightly. Would you like some water, ma'am? Her voice was exactly as it had been that day. Quiet. Almost trembling. The woman's chest tightened. She started, but before she could finish, the janitor stepped forward. Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. Did I not clean fast enough for you? Did I offend you by existing? The exact words she had said to him before. She remembered that moment. The way she had scowled at him. The way she had demanded the hotel fire him for being incompetent. She had forgotten about it minutes after it happened. But he hadn't. And now, neither could she. Her breathing became shallow. She turned back to the chauffeur. Take me home. Right now. His gaze met hers in the rearview mirror. His deep brown eyes didn't waver. Home? He repeated. Where is home for someone like you? Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. Still no signal. Her power, her status, her name, none of it mattered here. She clenched her fists, forcing her voice to steady. "You don't understand who I am." The chauffeur gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Oh, I understand exactly who you are." And then, the world shifted again. The air around her became thick and heavy. The road outside seemed to twist, stretching into infinity. The figures of the people she had wronged began to blur and change. They weren't just people anymore. They were her memories. Every unkind word, every cruel act, every moment of thoughtless arrogance, they surrounded her now, towering over the limousine like giants. A businessman she had once mocked for wearing an old suit. A struggling mother she had scoffed at for asking for help. A homeless man she had ignored while he begged for a meal. She could feel their judgment. Not hatred, that would have been easier to handle. It was something worse. It was the weight of knowing she had never been the hero in anyone's story. Her breathing came faster now, shallow and panicked. "I want to go back." The chauffeur didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the gear shift and pulled it into drive. The door slammed shut on its own. And the limousine began moving forward. Straight into the unknown. The limousine glided forward, deeper into the ever-changing world that surrounded them. The towering memories, the people she had dismissed, mocked, and humiliated, faded like smoke, only to be replaced by something even more unsettling. The wealthy woman pressed herself against the seat, staring out in horror. The road outside twisted into something new. It wasn't empty anymore. It wasn't unfamiliar. It was a city. But not the one she knew. The streets were cracked and broken, lined with flickering neon signs that buzzed erratically. The buildings were familiar but decayed, as if this world had taken the city she ruled over and dragged it through centuries of neglect. She recognized the restaurants, the boutiques, the five-star hotels, but everything was in ruins. And then, she saw the people. Crowds of them, dressed in rags, their faces hollow, tired, and hopeless. Something about them looked familiar. Her stomach knotted as the realization hit her. These were the people she had looked down on. The servers, the cashiers, the drivers, the doormen, the ones she had ignored, insulted, belittled. Now, they walked these streets like shadows of their former selves, struggling, suffering, just as she had always assumed they would. She swallowed hard. "Why are you showing me this?" The chauffeur's voice was calm. Too calm. "You never cared what happened to them after you walked away. So now, you get to see." Her skin went cold. "This is punishment. This is some kind of twisted game." "I don't belong here," she said quickly. "This isn't my world." The chauffeur turned slightly, his deep brown eyes meeting hers in the mirror. "No?" The limousine slowed to a stop. The door unlocked. And before she could react, it swung open. A powerful force yanked her forward, and suddenly, she wasn't in the limousine anymore. She was standing on the street. The chauffeur was gone. The car vanished as if it had never existed. She turned in circles, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She was alone. Except she wasn't. A shadow loomed over her. She looked up, and her stomach twisted into a knot. She was standing in front of a building she knew all too well. Her office. Only, it wasn't hers anymore. The once polished glass doors were covered in grime. The golden logo above the entrance was chipped and rusted. And in the reflection of the glass, she saw something that made her stumble backward. Her own face. But she wasn't the same. Her elegant dress was gone, replaced with a cheap, tattered jacket. Her perfect hair was messy, her makeup smudged, her shoes worn and broken. She looked like one of them. A nobody. A struggling, invisible, powerless nobody. Her throat closed as panic suffocated her. No. No, this isn't real. This isn't me. But as she looked around, nobody recognized her. The same employees who used to rush to serve her walked right past her, barely glancing in her direction. She saw her former assistant step out of the building. But instead of looking timid and fearful like she used to, the assistant walked with confidence, wearing the very designer suit the wealthy woman once flaunted. The world had flipped. She wasn't the powerful one anymore. And no one cared. Her voice shook as she grabbed the assistant's sleeve. Wait. It's me. The assistant ripped her arm away, disgust flashing in her eyes. Excuse me? Don't touch me. The words hit like a slap. She had said those exact words before. 1,000 times. She staggered back, her mind racing. She turned to another person, a doorman she once ignored. Please, just listen to me. I don't know what's happening. The doorman barely glanced at her before muttering, "Move along, lady. You don't belong here." Her world spun. She didn't belong. She was no one. And for the first time in her life, she knew exactly how it felt. A sob rose in her throat, but before she could process it, a familiar voice whispered behind her. How does it feel? She turned, her heart slamming against her ribs. The chauffeur stood behind her, watching. But he wasn't wearing his uniform anymore. He was dressed in the wealth and power she once carried. And in his eyes, she saw something terrifying. The truth. The wealthy woman staggered backward, her breath coming in short gasps as she stared at the chauffeur. Except he wasn't a chauffeur anymore. He stood tall, his posture relaxed, dressed in the very power she once wielded. His suit was crisp, expensive. His shoes gleamed under the dull city lights. His presence commanded attention. He had become her. And she had become nothing. Her voice trembled. What is this? The chauffeur tilted his head slightly, observing her as though she were a curiosity. It's your world, he said, his tone cool, from the other side. She shook her head violently. No, this isn't right. You did something. This is some kind of sick joke. The chauffeur's lips barely curled. Not quite a smile, something else. You always assumed the world belonged to people like you. That others existed only to serve, to be ignored, to be dismissed. She clenched her fists. I never said that. You didn't have to. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The world around her was still shifting. The towering office building loomed over her, no longer a place where she gave orders, but a place that now seemed utterly unreachable. People passed her without a second glance. No one held open doors. No one offered fake politeness. She was just another nobody on the street. She clenched her teeth, forcing herself to stand tall. Fine. You want me to play along? I'll play. I know how to fix this. I'll work my way back up. I'll prove I'm not like them. The chauffeur raised a single brow. Them? Her words caught in her throat. She didn't mean to say it like that. But she had. He took a slow step forward, his presence overwhelming. So, you still believe you're different? Special? Better? She glared at him. I built my success. I earned it. The chauffeur let out a quiet hum. Did you? And suddenly, the world shifted again. Her stomach lurched, the air grew heavy, and in a blink, she was no longer on the sidewalk. She was behind the wheel of a car. Her hands were gripping a leather steering wheel, but it wasn't the familiar luxury of her limousine. It was a driver's seat. The driver's seat. She was a chauffeur now. Her mouth went dry. No, this isn't happening. She looked in the rearview mirror. And her own reflection wasn't there. Instead, she saw herself, sitting in the back seat. Dressed in riches. Looking down at her. The other version of her, the one still in control, smirked. And then, the words came. Cold. Careless. Drive. Her body moved on instinct. She pressed the gas. The car began rolling forward. She tried to stop herself, to yank her hands off the wheel, but she couldn't. She was trapped. Forced to experience exactly what it felt like. She had always assumed being a driver was easy. That service work was beneath her. But now she felt everything. The way her shoulders ached from sitting too long. The way her back screamed from being in one position for hours. The way her dignity shrank every time she was ignored, dismissed, treated as nothing. And worst of all, she felt the weight of being invisible. Faster, her own voice commanded from the back seat. Her hands obeyed. Take the long way. I need to make a phone call. Her stomach twisted. She had said those words so many times. But she had never stopped to think about what they meant. That every time she wasted a worker's time for her own convenience, it was someone's life she was treating like a disposable service. The ride stretched on for what felt like hours. And by the time it ended, she felt hollow. The door in the back opened. Her wealthy self stepped out, never once looking at her. She wanted to scream. To make herself seen. But before she could, the world shifted one last time. She was back on the sidewalk, standing in front of the chauffeur. Her body shook. The truth was sinking in now. She had never understood. Not until now. The chauffeur watched her closely. And for the first time since this nightmare began, he asked her a question. Are you ready to listen? She didn't answer. She just nodded. And the world around them began to change again. The world shifted again. The weight of the experience she had just endured lingered in her chest, pressing down like a heavy stone. She had lived the other side of her own actions, felt what it was like to be ignored, belittled, dismissed. And now, she was afraid. Because she didn't know what would come next. She stood in front of the chauffeur, her breaths uneven, shaky. For the first time in her life, she had no words. The chauffeur watched her, his expression unreadable. His presence still held power, but there was no anger in his eyes, just something else. Something deeper. Are you ready to listen? He asked again. She hesitated. Her instinct, the part of her that had ruled her entire life, wanted to resist. To fight. To deny that she had done anything wrong. But after everything she had just lived through, she couldn't. So instead, she nodded. The chauffeur exhaled softly, almost as if he had been waiting for this moment. And the world shifted once more. A powerful force pulled at her, and suddenly, she wasn't standing on the sidewalk anymore. She was somewhere else. Somewhere familiar. Her eyes widened. She was in a restaurant. Not just any restaurant, the one she had dined at frequently. The one where she had once mocked a waitress for being too slow. She looked down. Her elegant dress was gone. Her jewelry was gone. Her wealth was gone. And instead of sitting at a table, she was standing with a notepad in her hands. She was the waitress now. Her pulse spiked. No, not again. Please, I get it, order up, someone yelled behind her. A tray was shoved into her hands, heavier than she expected. The smell of sizzling steak and steaming vegetables filled her nose. Then, voices. Sharp, impatient, demanding voices. What's taking so long? This service is terrible. Did they hire people off the street or what? You're getting no tip, just so you know. Each sentence cut through her like a blade. Because she had said these very same things before. She turned, facing the table where the complaints were coming from. And her stomach dropped. She was serving herself. Her wealthy self sat at the table, arms crossed, rolling her eyes in exaggerated frustration. Finally, she shows up. What did you do, take a nap in the kitchen? Her hands shook as she set the tray down. Her former self barely looked at her. Just scoffed and muttered, pathetic. The wealthy woman felt something inside her break. Because now, she felt what it was like. She felt the shame, the frustration, the utter powerlessness of being treated like nothing. She wanted to scream at herself, to shake the version of her that sat at that table and make her understand. But she couldn't. Because that wasn't her anymore. The scene around her began to blur, fading like mist. She gasped as she felt herself being pulled again, and in a blink, she was back on the sidewalk. Back in front of the chauffeur. Her legs felt weak. She wanted to collapse. But instead, she looked up at him, really looked at him. And for the first time since this all began, she saw him differently. Not as a chauffeur. Not as someone beneath her. But as a man. A man who had lived these experiences every single day. Her throat tightened. I didn't know, she whispered. The chauffeur studied her. Didn't you? She swallowed hard. And finally, she admitted it. I didn't care. The words felt heavy. Like chains breaking. She hadn't cared. Not about the waitress, or the janitor, or the driver, or anyone she had looked down on. Because she had always assumed their struggles weren't her problem. But now she knew. And she would never forget. The chauffeur nodded. And the world around them began to shift for the last time. She wasn't sure where it would take her next. But for the first time in her life, she was ready to see. The world around her began to dissolve, the sidewalk, the towering buildings, the ruined city. It all faded like ink in water, blurring, twisting, vanishing into nothingness. For a moment, she stood in complete darkness. Weightless. Suspended in an empty void. Her breath hitched. Was this it? Was this the end? Then, a sound. Faint at first. A rhythmic, steady clicking. She knew that sound. The turn signal of a car. And just like that, light exploded around her. She was back in the limousine. Everything looked exactly as it had before, the leather seats, the dim overhead lights, the quiet hum of the road beneath them. Had it been a dream? A vision? A trick? Her hands gripped the seat. Her pulse raced. She turned sharply, staring at the chauffeur. He was exactly where she had left him. His uniform was crisp, his hands steady on the wheel, his posture calm and composed. As if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't just lived through an entire lifetime of lessons. As if she hadn't just been forced to feel the weight of her own actions. Her throat felt tight. For the first time since she had stepped into the car, she really looked at him. His hands weren't just steady, they were worn. Calloused. Strong. His eyes weren't just calm, they were deep, knowing, filled with something she had never bothered to notice before. She had spent her life assuming people like him didn't matter. That their stories, their struggles, their experiences were insignificant. She had been wrong. She had been so horribly wrong. Her lips parted, but for the first time in her life, she didn't know what to say. She had mocked this man. Insulted him. Treated him like a disposable function in her life. But now she saw him. She saw all of them. The waitress. The janitor. The assistant. The people she had ignored, dismissed, humiliated. She saw herself. And she hated what she had been. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. I'm sorry, she whispered. Her own voice sounded foreign in her ears. The chauffeur didn't react at first. He simply drove in silence. Then, after a long pause, he glanced at her in the mirror. And for the first time since this journey began, he smiled. A small, knowing, almost imperceptible smile. The car slowed to a stop. She looked outside. They were back where they had started. The towering glass building. The bustling streets. The flashing city lights. It was as if nothing had changed. Except for one thing. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. The door unlocked with a soft click. She hesitated. And then, slowly, she reached for the handle and stepped out. As she stood on the pavement, something inside her felt different. The chauffeur didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Because she understood now. This hadn't been just a lesson. This had been a second chance. She turned back, her eyes searching his. "Thank you," she said softly. She stood on the pavement, her heels clicking softly against the cold concrete. The limousine was still there, its glossy surface reflecting the golden lights of the towering skyscrapers. Everything looked the same. The city still buzzed with life, honking taxis, pedestrians rushing past, neon signs flickering against the night sky. And yet, she felt completely different. The weight in her chest, the tight grip of arrogance and superiority she had always carried, it was gone. The chauffeur sat in the driver's seat, hands resting on the wheel, watching her in the mirror. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something she hadn't noticed before. Not anger. Not resentment. Expectation. As if he were waiting to see if she had truly learned. Her heart pounded. What now? What was she supposed to do? She had lived through something impossible. She had seen the world through their eyes, the people she had once dismissed as insignificant. She had felt the sting of being ignored, the burn of being looked down upon, the suffocating helplessness of being trapped in a cycle where no one cared who you were. And it had changed her. Hadn't it? She hesitated, fingers tightening around the strap of her designer purse. The door was still open. She could still go back. Back to the life she had built. Back to her wealth, her comfort, her status. But the question was, could she really go back to being the same person? A gust of wind rushed past, carrying the sound of laughter from a nearby street cafe. She turned her head, watching as a waitress set down a tray in front of a table, smiling at the couple seated there. The scene should have been ordinary. But to her, it wasn't. She saw it differently now. She saw the exhaustion in the waitress's posture, the practiced patience in her expression, the quiet way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she turned to leave. She had never noticed those things before. Had never cared to. But now. Now, she did. She swallowed hard and turned back to the limousine. The chauffeur's eyes met hers in the mirror. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, carefully, she stepped forward. Not back into the limousine. But to the front. She raised a trembling hand and knocked on the passenger side window. The chauffeur raised a brow but said nothing as he pressed a button, lowering the glass. She took a deep breath. "What's your name?" It felt strange, asking something so simple. Because the truth was, she had never cared enough to ask before. The chauffeur studied her for a long moment, then tilted his head slightly. "Does it matter?" She blinked. It should have mattered. Didn't it? "Yes," she said, her voice quieter than before. "Yes, it does." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, the chauffeur nodded. "My name is Elias." Elias. A real name. A real person. Not just a uniform. Not just a function in her life. A person. Her chest tightened as she forced herself to meet his gaze. Elias, she repeated, tasting the name on her tongue. She hesitated. And then, for the first time in her life, she said something she had never said to someone like him before. Would you like to get a cup of coffee with me? The chauffeur, Elias, blinked. For the first time, his calm, unreadable expression broke into something softer. Something almost amused. Coffee, he echoed. She nodded. It wasn't much. But it was something. A first step. A new beginning. A second chance. Elias studied her carefully. Then, without a word, he turned off the car's ignition, removed the key, and opened his door. The woman released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. As they walked side by side toward the cafe, she knew, this was the moment that mattered. Because in the grand scheme of life, wealth fades. Power shifts. Status means nothing. But the way you treat people? That lasts forever. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly as the wealthy woman, or rather, the woman who had once believed wealth was all that mattered, stepped inside. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sitting at the finest table, waiting to be served. She was here as an equal. The warm scent of roasted coffee beans filled the air. The quiet murmur of conversation hummed around them. It was a place she had walked past 1,000 times, never sparing a second glance. Now, it felt different. Elias walked beside her, his usual composed demeanor unchanged. But there was something else there now, a quiet curiosity. She approached the counter. The young barista behind it looked tired, but her smile was still genuine. "Good evening," the barista said. "What can I get for you?" The woman hesitated for only a second before offering a small, hesitant smile in return. She turned to Elias. "What would you like?" He raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "You're asking me?" She nodded. A pause. Then, he exhaled and shrugged. "Black coffee." She turned back to the barista. "2 black coffees, please. No fancy orders. No special requests. Just 2 simple cups of coffee." As they waited, she took in the cafe around her. She saw the exhausted mother rocking a baby in the corner booth. The old man stirring sugar into his tea with shaking hands. The waitress balancing a tray with practiced ease. All people she would have never noticed before. When the coffee arrived, she didn't wait for Elias to take his first sip. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. She placed it on the counter, sliding it toward the barista. "Keep the change." The young woman's eyes widened. "Ma'am, this is way too much." The woman smiled softly. "It's just enough." For once, she didn't tip because she had to. She did it because she wanted to. Because she understood now. As they found a small table by the window, Elias watched her carefully over the rim of his cup. "So, what happens now?" he asked. She exhaled slowly, looking down at her own reflection in the dark liquid. It was a good question. She had spent years building an empire, believing she was untouchable. But in a single night, her entire perspective had changed. "I don't know," she admitted. And for the first time in her life, she was okay with that. Elias smirked. "That's a good start." They sat in companionable silence, sipping their coffee as the world moved around them. At that moment, she wasn't a millionaire. She wasn't a CEO. She wasn't someone who mattered more than anyone else in the room. She was just a person. And for the first time, that was enough.